So I feel like there's a lot out there for people who are clinically diagnosable, people who have bulimia, people who have anorexia, people who have binge eating disorder. However, I find it crazy that we think, hey, those people struggle with emotional issues around food, but everybody else who doesn't have bulimia or binge eating disorder, theirs must just be somehow a problem with nutrition. When the reality is, I really see it as a continuum. And what you see is 60% of all people struggling with eating actually say that it's emotional and not a lack of nutritional information. And so I'm targeting those people that are emotional eaters that don't actually have an eating disorder, but those people are at high risk for developing an eating disorder. And what happens is they're already at a high risk for an eating disorder. They go on a calorie counting app and it actually triggers eating disorders, whereas mine prevents it.
Hello, I'm Deep Dhillon, your host, and today on Your AI Injection, we're diving into the intersection of AI and mental health with Dr. Sera Lavelle, co-founder of Via Better Eating and owner of New York Health Hypnosis and Integrative Therapy. Dr. Lavelle holds a PhD in clinical psychology and an MA in clinical psychology from Adelphi University, along with an MA in Psych from New York University. She's also served as an adjunct professor at both CUNY and Adelphi. At Via Better Eating, she leverages over 18 years of clinical experience to reshape people's relationship with food and drive sustainable change. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Sarah. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to it.
Awesome. So maybe start us off by telling us, like, what did people do without your solution and what's different with your solution? Maybe walk us through a scenario.
Yeah, it's a really hard one because I feel like everybody struggles with food, right? On some level. People are either motivated to lose weight or there's still even motivation to keep a person's weight where they are. But everybody wants their habits to be better. And if they're not using my app, really the only solutions out there are getting more diet advice or people going to kind of like calorie counting apps. But in this day and age, I don't really think anybody's wondering if a carrot is better for you than a cupcake, right? So
Uh-huh.
we're kind of doing things based on this really old model. Like a lot of apps that are out there right now are kind of digitized 1960s food journal, right? They're tracking your food and they're counting up your calories. Mine is really addressing the emotional aspects. Really, when you think about it, people are craving food, they overeat, they're throwing all logic out the window, and they really don't know where to turn. So sometimes they're turning to diet apps, sometimes they're turning to nutritionists, sometimes they are going to therapy for it because a lot of people are becoming understanding that it's psychological. But I really see my app as kind of giving people a place to unravel what's going on for them emotionally with food so they stop having emotional cravings and they're able to stop eating when they're full, as opposed to
Yeah.
continuing to eat even past the point that they're full because they're trying to kind of soothe and like give themselves
So
emotional soothing.
tell me a little bit more about, like, what's the typical patient? How do they get to you?
Mhm.
And what kind of emotion-driven eating are you sort of
Mhm.
describing? Is it like depression oriented or something
Mhm.
else? Like maybe walk us through it.
So that's a really great question. So I feel like there's a lot out there for people who are clinically diagnosable, people who have bulimia, people who have anorexia, people who have binge eating disorder. However, I find it crazy that we think, hey, those people struggle with emotional issues around food, but everybody else who doesn't have bulimia or binge eating disorder, theirs must just be somehow a problem with nutrition. When the reality is, I really see it as a continuum. And what you see is 60% of all people struggling with eating actually say that it's emotional and not a lack of nutritional information. And so I'm targeting those people that are emotional eaters that don't actually have an eating disorder, but those people are at high risk for developing an eating disorder. And what happens is they're already at a high risk for an eating disorder. They go on a calorie counting app and it actually triggers eating disorders, whereas mine prevents it.
That's super interesting. So what kinds of emotional stuff happens to cause people to like
Mhm.
manifest it in eating? I mean, I think most people have a sense, I don't know if it's correct or not, of like bulimia or anorexia,
Mhm.
which is like kind of body image related emotional stuff.
Mhm.
What other kinds of things are there?
I think just like any vice, just like alcohol, a person might not be an alcoholic, but they might be going to alcohol to soothe work stress, or they can't tolerate being angry at their spouse, so they're going to alcohol. It's a lot of the same things. What you find about emotional eaters is they tend to not be drinkers, they tend to not be drug users. they tend to be the people who this is kind of their only vice. They vacillate between trying to be perfect with their diet and then breaking down and eating cookies at night. And it's very upsetting. Doing that every day over and over really affects your self-esteem, but it's not an eating disorder. And where do you go for that? Because again, if you go to a nutritionist, they're going to say, okay, great, don't eat cookies at night. And they're going to say, well, wonderful. I know that.
Problem
How do I stop
solved.
eating cookies? Problem solved.
Because they've got 15 minutes to interact with you and then they're on to the next patient. Yeah.
Yeah. And the problem is when somebody's overwhelmed with emotion, all logic flies out the window. So even though the nutritionist might be giving great advice, they're not able to access it emotionally in that moment. They're not able to hear that advice because they're thinking, I want to be bad right now. I've had a bad day, screw it. I'm just going to eat this thing right now.
Interesting. So going back to like the solutions in quotations that exist today, you mentioned like calorie counting or diet journals. You mentioned just nutritional information, but within the emotional eating space, what happens today without your solution?
I really see it as a big gap. So for instance, I own 2 therapy practices in New York City, and we see people coming to this for us all the time. And we have to sit there and tell them, look, we can provide therapy, but guess what? Insurance is not going to cover this because you don't qualify as having an eating disorder. So people, if they have the means, are spending a lot of money for therapy for this issue, and it's extremely effective. I think a lot of people want therapy, but they know that they don't qualify as having a disorder. So what we do is we try to target those people that, really want the tools to stop overeating, but don't qualify. And what we do even further is we use the AI to determine, hey, is this a person that might have an eating disorder? And if we do, we help them find a therapist in their area that's not even connected to our app, so that we make sure that we're very appropriate in providing both preventative and supplemental help, but that we're not crossing the line and saying, hey, you know what, you're severely bulimic, this app can solve everything. However, that person who is perfect all day, eating the cookies at night, which is really almost everybody who's trying to lose weight, we're there for them to provide them an approach that's grounded in research that helps their self-esteem and prevents eating disorders, as opposed to kind of going to something that they try it for a while, they drop off, and then they feel like a failure.
Got it. Maybe walk us through the app. Maybe make up a scenario. How do they encounter the app? Where do they get it? When they get it down? How often are they interacting with it? What are they doing the first time, the next few times?
Yeah. So we just launched our MVP. And I'm thrilled about it. There's so many things that we want it to do eventually. But what's really amazing is people find it just on our very, very basic marketing, because we target things like, emotional cravings and overeating. And we get a 30% conversion rate because people are searching these things. They're not really searching weight loss and diet. They're searching, how do I stop from overeating? And they find us. People download it. And the first thing it says is, what's your biggest struggle with food? And it says, is it overeating? Is it consistency? And it starts having a conversation with you. And then it might recommend one of our specific activities. There's kind of the open chat that you could just talk to all day, and it will help you unravel what's going on. But if it detects something that might help, it'll take you to one of the guided activities within our app, which is knowledge, motivation, meditation. Knowledge is going to be like, look, we're going to teach you how to differentiate real hunger from psychological hunger, or teach you some mindful eating techniques, or teach you something about the way you're approaching food. Motivation is where a person will go, wow, I'm about to overeat. I've had a bad day. What should I do? And it's going to walk you through a psychological technique that's going to stop you in your tracks. It's going to walk you off the ledge. Maybe it's going to be a mindfulness exercise. Maybe it's going to be a visualization, but it's going to be something that's going to make you pause, reflect before you go on. And then meditation is actually Ericksonian hypnosis. So it's kind of like a headspace, except for it's created by psychologists that both improves body image and helps you to stop eating when you're full. So it's not saying you need to diet. It's eliminating those times that you might go way past what your body actually needs. So we're taking the 3 most effective techniques that we would use in therapy. However, we're now making it so that the everyday person who's struggling has a more psychologically sound approach than continuing to try a diet for a while and fail. It's made to heal your relationship with food, not necessarily even to lose weight.
Yeah. Maybe let's dig into a few of those things kind of one by one. So let's start with maybe the chat modality. So
Hmm.
so you start talking to this thing. I'm guessing you
Hmm.
have an LLM behind the scenes.
Hmm.
Maybe walk us through a little bit about like what is different from your fine tuning on that conversational side
Hmm.
and that prompting and how that works, what your main goals
Hmm.
are with the prompting, how you
Hmm.
deal with the guardrails issue and
Yeah, there's so much to it. And that's a really great question because also, being a practice owner, being a clinical psychologist, I'm going to be a lot more clear in my guardrails in training the AI than other people. First is we trained it on basic research-based techniques. I mean, that's always going to be the first layer. But we actually created a completely separate proprietary private logic layer that I've actually dumped ideas of real things I've heard people say in therapy, the kind of responses I give, podcasts I've done, blogs I've done, so that it's like this separate database. We built it on OpenAI, but it's
Mhm.
LLM agnostic actually, because we can plug our layer onto anything. So if we want to change at any point, we can, but it kind of gives a scale. Is this better responded by the LLM that's been retrained universe, or do we answer actually based on our own separate knowledge base that we pull from in order to answer? So for instance, if you ask ChatGPT the same question, you're going to get an entirely different response. If you ask Via, could you help me stick to 1,000 calories a day? ChatGPT might give you advice on how to stick to 1,000 calories a day. Via would say, I really don't recommend that. Why don't we instead talk about what's going on for you? That A, you want to stick to that kind of goal. And B, if you're going vastly over that, well, let's focus on just helping you choose healthier foods and to stop eating when you're full. So it's trained
Yeah.
in a very specific way.
So it sounds like you have your own content, and maybe manifested in some
Mhm.
question answering as well, where for
Uh-huh.
particular questions you have particular responses you want to give. I'm assuming you built your own RAG system or something to kind of look up local
Hmm.
content and then go to the LLM to kind of
Hmm.
tailor responses.
We built our own system
Yeah,
and that it does pull from there, right? And it has
right.
kind of a score of whether or not it's more relevant.
Yeah. So you've got your RAG system. You have this process for curating content.
Mm-hmm.
Walk me through like how the psych specific content manifests
Mm-hmm.
itself. Like, are
Mm-hmm.
you guys sort of reviewing conversations between patients and the bot and then weighing in with, a team of clinical psychologists and then you're
Mm-hmm.
sort of updating your knowledge kind of repeatedly? Like
Mm-hmm.
how does that
Yeah.
layer
Yeah,
work?
because we had launched 2 months ago, we haven't updated it as much as we'd like to. But it is something definitely in the works that we're going to be updating it continually to just have better and better and more refined, more individualized content. But also, it's going to learn your certain behaviors as well. On top of that, that's how we trained it. But we also have a lot of different safety features in place. What we actually do is we have that layer of like risk, harm, suicidality, homicidality. But we also have our separate layer of making sure we're practicing within scope. So we've trained it on tons of examples of the kinds of things a person would say if they had an eating disorder. So that if somebody kind of triggers that, it would remind them, hey, I can't actually diagnose, but the way that you're talking, it sounds like you might have an eating disorder. Would you like me to help you find a therapist in your area? Right now, we give them a general resource, Psychology Today, which can target a person in your area. And we're not even referring to ourselves because this is an MVP. But in the future, we plan to have a huge provider network, as well as kind of different levels of care. To me, that's very important to make that distinction so that when a person really is struggling, they're not getting more frustrated because they actually need more help than that's able to provide.
So let's say you recommend a therapist.
Mhm.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but I've almost
Mhm.
never seen a therapist who's recommended have any kind of availability. Like
Mhm. It's
so
really
I
hard.
mean we had to find a therapist during the depths of COVID and
Well, that was the
it was
hardest by
like
far.
it was incredible. Like, I mean, I have a large
Mhm.
network, and my wife does too. I personally know like more than a few handfuls of
Mhm.
therapists, and it
Mhm.
still took us almost a year till we found somebody good.
That's why I want
But
to really build out that network. And what I love is what things like Headspace Health are doing and Ben
uh-huh.
Health, in that they have these tiers. For instance, you have coaches that are supervised by psychologists. So if we ever wanted to use coaches like that a person can have as an add-on, we'd have somebody well trained in kind of coaching if they weren't clinically diagnosable. But you'd also then have a supervisor help monitoring if the person actually needed a higher level of care. And then we'd also have our own set of psychologists. We'd either partner with a big clinic, which is one thing we're looking at, that, we could ensure that had availability, or we would actually create a more medically aligned version of it, saying the care team has decided this warrants that you get professional psychological guidance. Would you like us to make an appointment with this provider?
Need help building a great chatbot, or perhaps help with computer vision, natural language processing, automated content creation, conversational understanding, time series forecasting, customer behavior analytics? Reach out to us at zyonix.com. That's XYONIX.com. Maybe we can help.
Let's talk about that. When people talk to bots in a psychotherapeutic kind of context, one of the kind of assumptions is like, oh, they're not going to really talk to them as much. And, the literature actually supports the opposite, that people feel not judged by a bot. They talk to it a lot more. But one of the things that happens with a human is there's a social bond that forms, and there's a sense of, you don't really care what a bot thinks about you, but you do care what a person thinks about you. And I imagine therapists really leverage that in the setting where, if you give somebody, a patient, a homework assignment to go, I don't know, review all their eating habits for the week or something, they're going to be much more likely to do it simply because you're a human, simply because they have to pay you a couple $100 for the hour, all of that. I had another psychotherapist on the podcast a while back, and one of the things she said really struck me. She was like, the interaction between patients and bots can be helpful, but the future of psychotherapy that I see is one that goes back before the time of psychotherapists, when people actually had peers that contribute and help them out in their therapeutic context, which is a lot of fancy words for just saying you've got friends and family that are there for you, and know how to say things that are helpful. Is there a social role that can be played? Because we both know that there's a massive shortage of therapists. They're incredibly expensive. There's a ton of people who could never afford $200 an hour, even if they could get a therapist. How can you tap into that need for kind of being on the hook to other humans,
The first one I always say is there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages of AI, but there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages of humans. And in all of our talks about accessibility, obviously getting there is a hurdle. Price is a hurdle. Insurances are a hurdle. But I think the biggest hurdle a lot of times is the internal one. Even within my therapy practice, we don't work with people who have eating disorders. We work with people who have eating disorders that are willing to come into therapy. There are plenty of people who've stayed bulimic for 30 years. Their husbands, their wives might not even know, and they're not going to therapy. They're not ready to talk to a real human. And when AI is done well, I think you could get the best of humans and you could get the best of AI, and it's a beautiful connection. So one thing about working with eating disorders is that it's one of the few things that Therapeutic Alliance is negatively correlated with treatment outcomes. What I mean by that is the more you like your therapist, the less likely you are to tell them, look, I binged last night. I ate 4,000 calories in one sitting and then I vomited. You don't want to tell your therapist that, right? Now, having
that's
an AI there,
that's like the opposite side of the point I'm making. Yeah.
Yeah. But what happens is if you have AI between sessions, you are not vulnerable with them, which is a good and bad thing. But then you practice telling the AI, and it's easier to open up to your therapist. You've already said it 5 times during the week. I think it can make the therapy more productive.
Maybe even you talk to the AI, and then you come back to the patient. You're like, hey, look, I think that we should, forward this on to a therapist or for that particular interaction or something. Here's my summary of what you've told me. Are you okay with us sending this to the therapist and then you talking to them? Right? Because that's like a different kind of thing than a team that's not forthcoming with words, but being able to just say yes, no is a much easier kind of hurdle for them.
Exactly. People don't realize being a practice owner in therapy, you need to put in so many guardrails, right? What you're talking about is kind of like a virtual release of information. You're getting their consent to share the information. And the same thing that makes therapy practices run are what I see as making mental health startups succeed or fail. Level of care. I don't think that's talked about enough within AI. We have an intensive screening process for people who call to make sure that we're the right level of care, meaning that they're, like, I hate to say it this way, but sick enough. And we need to tell them in the first session, we could see you or not, but you might not warrant a diagnosis. Or, hey, you warrant a diagnosis, we're the appropriate providers for you. Or, hey, you know what, you're bipolar. This person's in the active manic phase. And we might be able to take you if we can coordinate with the psychiatrist and the other care team, or you might be in a place that you need either an IOP or inpatient. And we are so trained in level of care and the appropriate level of care, and every practice has to put those things into place. And I think any kind of like AI really conceptualizes the same way that therapists do in terms of level of care.
I'm imagining quite a bit that can be done. Once you're in a safe conversational space, you wind up with these really kind of rich conversational histories. You can do a lot of analysis against that, where you can start to determine all these kinds of specific scenarios that maybe in a clinical context you guys assess. I think you can start to gather actual ground truth data. You can actually start to classify a particular patient into these areas and come up with some kind of assessment, and then based on that recommend human interaction or whatever.
But
or
then
maybe
again, like
lessons. You mentioned that you guys you have this kind of content as well that they interact with.
Yeah. But then you think about it as well. Like one thing that's a topic of conversation is, as a society, as an app developer, if somebody says, I'm going to kill somebody right now, or if they say in a chat bot, I'm going to kill myself, should that automatically call 911? Was that person joking? Was it not? There's a lot of things I think we need to navigate. Is this passive suicidality? Is this active suicidality? Do they have access to a gun? Even if somebody's sitting in your office and they say, man, I want to kill myself, you have to like listen to nuance. You can't call
right, because it can be a
inpatient.
sarcastic, backhanded comment.
Yeah.
Because I mean, like it's like you're young and hip, and you're like, "Oh my God, I want to kill myself." That's a totally different. I want to kill myself.
Yeah.
We once did a project. I was working with a company. They basically, you're a Madonna or a Taylor, huge pop star, popular music. Yeah, it could be a non-music thing too, but somebody who stands on stage and has a ton of followers. And they basically just make this system where you can put the phone number up and then like any of their fans can text them. You're getting millions of texts.
Yeah.
We were kind of tasked with like, hey, analyze this content and like break it down. And so we broke it down to like a few hundred categories of stuff. And we just assumed that the artist would be most interested in like how to optimize ticket sales or like, you know, what people wanted to hear at the shows and stuff. But there's like about 1% that was potential suicidal ideation, depression, like stuff that was in that ballpark that you're talking about.
Yeah.
To my surprise, the artists almost unanimously wanted us to exclusively focus on that, which I found fascinating. It's like,
yeah.
So one of the things we did is it turns out there's like multiple online API-based even services that pull down a human. We would just forward to them, and it's like the equivalent of 1-800 whatever.
Yeah.
And then there's a human behind the chat, and then they're right there. So
and then they can assess. Yeah, exactly. But then at what point would a actual human be better? What point could we actually understand sarcasm versus not? You know, one thing we're building in Be a Better Eating that I think a lot about is all weight loss apps bring in a large number of people with eating disorders. All of them do, as does Ozempic. Like Ozempic is
sure. I mean, it makes sense. Like, why else would they be there? Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like Ozempic cuts off cravings. It is the dream drug. It's an abused drug for people who struggle with anorexia because they don't like feeling hunger. And this is a drug that makes you not feel hunger.
Wait, I got to stop you there because I'm just curious. If you're anorexic, you're like bone thin. So why would you care about not wanting to eat more?
Because they're very frightened. So most people who have an eating disorder feel that their hunger is out of control, and they're very uncomfortable with any feelings of hunger, and they don't want to feel hunger. So they sit around not eating all day, and they're like, man, I'm hungry. What could I do to distract myself from hunger? I don't want to eat. I don't want to eat. I hate feeling hungry. And now you have something that takes that hunger away for them. And anorexia and bulimia are really two sides of the same coin.
But at some point, they still have to eat.
Well,
then they can do that on a schedule.
They die. You know, anorexia is 10 times more deadly than bulimia because they successfully starve. And now more people are successfully starving.
One thing we haven't talked about, what is the regulatory environment that you're operating in? Is there one and is there a line you're walking where you know, from counseling, you're not regulated? But I mean, obviously therapists are regulated and psychiatrists are absolutely regulated.
There's a regulation lag. And I think a lot of companies are going to suddenly be in trouble. And we will not be one of them. We are not holding ourselves out to the public as AI therapists. And we are clear, very clear. When you log into my app, the first thing it says is that this is self-help or emotional eating. We are not conducting therapy. We cannot diagnose. We don't say that we're AI therapy. we say that we're helping you with some interactive self-help tools and we're doing hypnosis, the moment that you reach a threshold for something diagnosable, we are actually referring you to a therapist. The other thing we're doing is building in a back-end dashboard, which I think should be a requirement, or at least something that respectable companies should do, is monitoring how often those things are triggered. So for instance, if it turns out like 75% of the people using my app do have eating disorders, that means I'm not marketing correctly and I should be doing some kind of a war, so you should be finding out, like, are you bringing in the correct users? Am I bringing in those people? I think it's the moral, ethical way to do things is kind of knowing a small percentage of people who shouldn't be on any app are going to go in, and how do you help those people? And are you putting yourself out to the world as, hey, I'm doing AI therapy, which tons of apps are doing right now.
Well,
Like
they
anything
are,
that
but
falls
like,
down.
I don't quite understand the
Mhm.
regulatory
Regulatory lag.
line. What's the line between just talking about food stuff, and what's the line at
Mhm.
which you pull down a ton of regulation
Mhm.
around, if you're advertising yourselves as a therapist, as a psychotherapist,
Mhm.
that's a different
Mhm.
thing, and you wind up
Yeah.
under FDA purview. So,
Mhm. Yes. So, for instance, I was just talking to my team about this because I don't want me just to be knowledgeable about this. I want everybody on my team to be knowledgeable. I could not call myself a therapist until I completed my PhD, completed my hours, or I couldn't say I practiced mental health. I couldn't say that I was a therapist. I couldn't say I was a psychologist until I was licensed by the state and completed a number of hours. Now, could people write a book that helps a person get over depression and gives them tools? Of course. Is that book conducting therapy? Is AI? So the things that would constitute as doing therapy would be diagnosing and treating a diagnosable mental health issue. It'd be using psychotherapy for an anxiety disorder, using psychotherapy for depression. Now, teaching people mindful eating techniques to help them with emotional eating when they clearly don't have a diagnosis. I just think that's helpful for society.
it sounds like that's kind of the line, is like, once you
Yeah.
know they have a diagnosis, you have to
Mhm.
like not have them in the app or something. I don't know how
Well,
that
yeah.
works.
So, for instance, I just put out a post on LinkedIn, and I don't like the term mental health coach. Just saying mental health coach, even if you said mental wellness coach, I might be okay with that because you're saying I'm focusing on mental wellness, whereas the term mental health makes, even if it's not legally wrong, you're going to invite in people who don't know the difference between a mental health coach and a therapist. But if you say mental wellness, or like even mental can be a little hard. If you say things like stress reduction as opposed to anxiety disorder, everybody has stress. Not
Yeah, yeah.
everybody has an anxiety disorder. It's a fine line. And I think people are taking advantage of a regulatory lag that will catch up. We are somebody where the lines could be somewhat fuzzy, as is anything right now. The fuzzier the lines, the more clarity you have to have in both your messages and the protocols you put in place to keep the public safe, right?
Right.
I don't see
So,
any other apps directing people to therapists where they're not even making money off of them. I'm seeing a lot of apps just saying, "Hey, I'm a therapy chatbot," with nobody even on psychology
oh
underneath.
yeah, I mean, like,
Like,
if you structure your ethical guidelines based on what everyone else is doing, you're not going to be particularly
yeah,
ethical.
yeah,
I mean,
and yeah,
even if you look at
mhm,
OpenAI, they're way over the line on FDA
yeah,
stuff. Like, I
yeah.
mean,
But there's no
along,
regulatory board right now for AI.
well,
There's regulatory board for
that's a
humans.
whole conversation that
Hmm.
I don't
Yeah.
think I don't need to have with
Mhm.
right now, or
we
I'll be
we
on
don't
your
have time.
couch. I'll be on your couch in like half an hour.
Yeah. Come
But
on over.
Have a ton of data, don't know where to start? Chat with one of our principal data scientists at xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com. You'll talk to an expert, not a salesperson.
So one of the things we like to talk about basically
Yeah.
three things on your AI injection. One of the things is, what are you building? I think
Hmm.
we've talked about that
Yeah.
a fair amount. The other thing that we like to talk about is how you're building it. I think we touched on that a
Hmm.
bit. The third piece, which we've also touched on, but let's dig into it even deeper, which is, should this
Hmm.
be built? The example I
Hmm.
usually bring up is, I think most entrepreneurs are aware of ethical lines that are current. And when startups have not yet become like tremendously successful, it's very easy to say, for example, and I don't mean to pick on you, but I'm going to pick on you a little bit. I'm going to just forward people to therapists. It's easy to do when you are early in your startup journey. But once you're in the growth stage, at some point you're going to be sitting in a board meeting if you're successful, and people are going to be obsessing on your churn rate, and they're going to be looking at it and they're going to say, you need to get this down by 4 percentage points. What's contributing it? And you're like, oh, well, we have a diagnosis module that runs behind the scenes. And if it detects like a significant mental health disparity, we send them to a therapist and then they disappear and never come back. And they're going to tell you, without telling you, to shut that off.
Yeah.
And so, like, what are those temptations that you see coming down the pipe if you're wildly successful, right? Like Mark Zuckerberg, I doubt he ever intentionally said, I'm going to like purposefully foster mobs to murder hundreds of thousands of people in Burma. But I think what he probably did was he said, we're going to scale to the entire world. And someone says, but we have no curators at all in Burma. And he's like, whatever, we'll deal with it later. That's probably what happened.
Yeah,
That kind of a problem is prolific in tech, right?
absolutely.
Look at YouTube. Like, I doubt anyone at Google said, let's spread massive conspiracy theories that ultimately threaten democracy. Like, I don't think they did that. I think you had a bunch of division heads who said optimize for engagement, algorithms optimize for engagement. The algorithms automatically learn that if you send somebody down the Alice in Wonderland crazy hole on the left or right, they get maximized engagement. So in your world, like, what are those temptations and how do you practically, realistically anticipate navigating those ethical minefields?
I have a question for you. How do you ask such great questions? I could talk to you about this for an hour. I mean, first of all, it's a very hard line. And you'll notice not a lot of mental health founders are mental health therapists. So look at Cerebral, for instance. They took advantage of a regulatory lag. So normally within psychiatry, you can't prescribe a controlled substance like ADHD medication without an in-person appointment. However, because of the pandemic, that was lax. So you had an MBA and an MD as co-founders. The MBA was fundraising. He went to VCs and said, look, we're going to incentivize psychiatrists to prescribe medication quicker and faster. And this is our business model. And they all said, great. Now we have medication shortages. And it got so bad that the DEA and the DOJ actually got involved. The MD on the team never wanted to have that model in the first place. So eventually they ousted the CEO and put the MD in charge. But the real kicker in my mind is that I don't think the MD would have ever gotten funded because some VCs, all they do
isn't
is
that
like,
just
blah,
the
blah,
reality
blah,
of
blah,
tech
blah.
startups, right?
I'm only aligning myself with VCs that have the end game in mind. I'm not aligning myself with VCs that want to go in and get out quickly because they're not going to like my model. And a lot of people don't want to invest in psychologists because they know that we're going to have those things. But they might be smart to not invest in an MD or a PhD. We have everything to lose. We could lose our licenses if we act unethically. If you're a tech founder within the mental health space, and what do you have to lose if you act unethically? You could lose your company, but you're not going to lose your entire career that you spent
Well, you could be like
$500,000 to get.
Elizabeth, whatever, the Theranos woman, and you could be sitting in a jumpsuit, but it is rare.
But not just that. Bend Health, I think, is a great organization, right? They accept insurance, they partner with companies, and they have a tiered model of mental health care. And so when we're talking about churn rate, right now, I just launched 2 months ago. It's an MVP. But I won't have the churn rate because I'll be referring to myself in a responsible way. Either that, or I'd create a separate revenue stream where we're partnering with a lot of great therapists that have availability.
I think that's the key, right? Like, this problem is extremely hard. I mean, at the end of the day, it gets down to the roots of capitalism and incentives, growth, and all of that.
Yeah.
But I think to the extent that the natural forces within your business are pushing you into the direction of doing the right thing as opposed to doing the wrong thing, I think that's when you kind of know that you're on the right track. Unfortunately, it's way harder to get that set up where you have the right incentives pushing you in the right direction. And usually it's like the line between you're actually trying to help people versus it's an entertainment app. It doesn't sound like you're going to make this decision, but people will tell you to entertainify it. And it depends on the revenue models you choose.
Ours is a subscription-based model. We're B2C, will also be B2B2C. But also, like, one thing people don't realize is sometimes they think they're acting ethically, but they don't. It's almost like they don't have the training enough to know. I had a person approach me, and I wrote a post about this. The person probably going to hate me because I talk about it so much. He's like, look, I just rained all this funding for a hypnosis app, and it's going to cure eating disorders and schizophrenia and bipolar. And I was like, cool, yeah, not going to be part of that. And he's like, well, I just got 10 million in funding. You could get this much percentage. You're not going to just stick your name on it. My investors told me they want me to get a therapist to slap their name on it. And you're well known in New York. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely not going to do it. And he's like, you know what? I think? I think all you doctors are just afraid of losing their job. My app works. I can help people all over the world, and you just want to keep people sick. And I think he believed that. I think he really believed. He'd done hypnosis once. It really helped him. I do believe in hypnosis. I practice hypnosis. I'm giving it to people, but through my app. But healing emotional eating through hypnosis versus saying, look, my app, you could just listen to a few sessions of hypnosis on this and it's going to cure your lifetime bulimia. You could trigger a person to feel like such a failure. I keep saying, like, my users aren't users. They're patients in my mind. They're a person who sat across the couch for me. I've had 17 years of people telling me how they really think, feel, and act. And most founders don't visualize that. No amount of market research is going to give you that kind of insight.
Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about that I'm curious your take on, and this might have to do with your company or not. It might be more about your therapy practice. So there's a reality of a clinician, right? Like whether it's a doctor or a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist, you have episodic or regular, but never continuous relationships with the patient. And what I mean by that is patient comes in once a month, once a week, or like when they break a leg or have an episode, right? They come in, you get a little itty bitty time window where you interact with them, right? So as a therapist, you probably know this really well. You spend an hour with them, they're gone for a week. What happens is your entire modality as a clinician is oriented around that tiny little time window that you get to say something.
45-minute window.
And so you deliver your information that you're going to deliver, and then they're off on their own. And so there's a phenomenon of giving the patient access to some form of that clinician 24/7. So for example, imagine you're a therapist dealing with maybe behavioral food issues, or maybe we're talking about more severe stuff than your current users.
Yeah, we'll say it's a patient. Yeah, like a patient in my practice. Yeah.
But clinicians supervised bot interactions or content consumption with a patient. So it's still supervised, but your patients now have access to a lot more of you than the 45-minute window.
Yeah.
Have you thought at all about that? What do you think the future is of that? Because we're seeing a lot of applications, doing that sort of thing in the physical therapy arena. And,
Yeah. There's two different issues here, right? Them having access to us and like a virtual, that could be like very calming, very grounding. But there's also something people don't realize in terms of how hard it is for us to have access to them all the time, right? So I have a lot of people trying to pitch my company like pretty regularly, and hospitals, and they're like, look, I have this great idea. I have this app that your patient can just chat at all time, and then you could look at it through the week and kind of like monitor how they're doing. I try to remind them, most therapists, especially in hospitals, are seeing 40 patients a week. They are so burnt out. And now you're asking them to do more work that's unpaid and have extra liability. Now there's this assumption that you're going to be reading everything they're writing all week. And if they say they're suicidal, I do think then we need to decrease patient loads and allow those kind of tools, because I think they'd be extremely helpful. But right now, I can't imagine a world with the current setup we have that a therapist has enough time to do that, and that any place wants to take on that liability.
This kind of brings me up to my last question, which is, hey, let's fast forward 5 or 10 years out. Everything you kind of are envisioning and want to happen happens. What does the world look like for good and for ill?
With my app or with the field of mental health in general?
Why don't you start with your app, but then let's talk about mental health in general.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, my app is clear. I see the apps, like so many apps trigger eating disorders, and that we have such a toxic relationship with food. and people have nowhere to go unless they're extremely disordered. And I would love to change the narrative that people could start talking about, hey, my struggle's emotional too, right? And people could start understanding all eating issues is an emotional issue and that people can stop feeling shameful. I have 7-year-old twins. And I don't want my daughter to grow up with the kind of images that I had with the Weight Watchers and the Diet Dr. Pepper. As long as it's diet and 0 calories, just put whatever in your body. I'm also sick of people feeling like failures if they can't stick to a diet. I would love a world, and this isn't saying I hate Ozempic or it's good or bad, but I would love to be in a world that people don't need Ozempic because like you're really just saving them from themselves, that we could cure things before it gets to a point that it's disordered. I want it to be more than the app, but I wanted a whole different narrative in understanding why people struggle with food.
To fast forward out 5, 10 years, whatever, thousands, hundreds, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of folks are using your app. They interact with it for a while. Their emotional issues with food presumably get solved. And then they stop using it and go back to life, something like that.
Right? Or like something like Calm or Headspace. For some people, it might be integrated in their lives.
So maybe you start walking out beyond this disorder and into other areas of maybe stress management or something like that.
Yeah. You're going to find the most change, of course, within the first month. But then after that, if you find that those cravings sneaking back in your ways, maybe you start talking to it a little bit more again, right? I want the narrative to change around food. Calorie counting was really popularized by this person named Lulu Peters in the 1920s. Then it exploded in the Weight Watchers era. And we haven't changed the model since the 1920s. And that
America's very obsessed with this thing. Like I noticed this doesn't happen in a lot of other countries. Other countries are not so metrics obsessed. Like people don't have Fitbits and smart watches where they obsess on the step counts, and calorie counting just seems like a part of that measurement obsessed world.
It's systematically teaching you to disregard your hunger and satiety signals because it's teaching you to think in terms of math as opposed to listening to your body. And I want to get away from that. So I want people to stop feeling like failures, understand it's a psychological struggle to whatever degree it is, for people to stop fat shaming and people start healing, right?
So let's talk about mental health in general. So AI, machine learning, significant advances. We're out 5 to 10 years. This is my biggest fear with respect to, I've been building AI machine learning systems for 30 years. Like this is all I do. And quite frankly, the models have gotten so powerful that it's starting to get amazing potential, but also like downright frightening. I feel like our society expects 16 years of double-blind studies before we regulate. And with respect to social media, we accepted astronomical increases in suicidal ideation amongst teen girls. We accepted eating disorders. Like I'm sure you know way more than I do about this. All this stuff we accepted in the name of like, well, it's just an app. And we listened to people like Zuckerberg just sweep it under the rug and ignore it completely. And we listen to all the other social media companies basically say, well, we don't know how to figure out age and all that stuff. So my fear with AI is I can't even imagine that in 3 years, every toddler does not have a stuffed animal they can talk to 24/7. I think they'll have many stuffed animals they can talk to 24/7. My fear is not so much that the companies that make these stuffed animals, they're going to be intentionally weird or controlling. I think what they're going to do is make them incredibly intentionally accommodating. Like if you go and just swear and scream and yell at ChatGPT, it's always very patient and calm with you. That's not what another toddler is going to do with you.
Yeah.
It's not, right? They're going to be pissed. They might smack you. They might bite you. They might kick you. So you learn consequences. And that sort of sullen, toddler who's not great at making friends, or 3-year-old or 5-year-old or 7 or 10 or 15-year-old, they're going to have other places to go. And I feel like the entire next generation of mental health disorders are going to come from this.
That's wild. That's so interesting because like my mind could go like swung to so many directions, right? Because that bear could do like social skills training and help, but it also could be like teaching a child that actually doesn't need friends in many ways, because this is going to be, this one thing that it can rely on so much. And again, it could be good intentioned people who are like, hey, this child.
It will be well-intentioned people, right?
Yeah.
It will be. That's how technology causes negative secondary effects, right? Nobody decided I need a smartphone in my pocket because I want 14-year-old girls to want to kill themselves.
Exactly. And then you talk about that churn rate, right? Because it's like My first thought was, hey, we'd have to train this teddy bear to be like, look, I love you, but I can't be your only friend. How about I help you talk to other people? And then you don't need the bear. And then the investors are going to be like, wait a minute, too high of a churn rate, right?
The bear does that, but at some point someone has to say, how often does it do it? And they'll say, oh, once a
Yeah.
week. And the kid will be like, yeah, I'll make friends. And then the kid keeps playing with the bear.
And then the kid doesn't exactly.
But
Right. But
look at the
again,
things that the kid's not doing when it's playing with the bear. Even if it's not
I
playing with other
know.
kids, they don't have an imaginary friend. I don't know. I'm not a therapist, but I imagine that plays some
Yeah.
kind of significant role in child development.
Yeah.
We've already massively hammered humanity's attention faculties. Like we already
Yeah.
cannot pay attention because of all this crap. And
Exactly.
now I'm worried that like what is all going to shake out from the fact that we
What
don't
are you
even
going
know
to
how
check out? But then again, like there's such a backlash too, right? Like like for instance, the more AI photos there are, like my friend who's a photographer, she's like, I've never been so busy because people actually want, and what people want are these more natural, raw photos. And you're even seeing that with social media. People want these like unedited, real videos. There's like polarization of it too, right? Like what I see for AI is that it's scalable, it's easily acceptable. But I think there's going to be this kind of like social construct that people think of this as like, hey, that's kind of like the cheap way to go and it's available. But if I really want an expert, I'm going to go elsewhere. And you'll see that's even with like scalable services, right? That's already happening.
That's only if the expert's better than the bots. That's
Hmm.
not actually what's happening. Like in
Well,
most areas, the bots
mm,
are better than the experts. Like whether it's
yeah.
diagnosing heartbeat
Hmm.
anomalies, beat
Hmm.
cardiologists. Whether it's
Yeah.
diagnosing, pneumonia, beat
Yeah.
you have
But
to
is
be
there
in the
more to it
top
than
like
diagnose?
1%.
Yeah. Well, and that is what's going to happen. And you see that in therapy practices. It's like I keep telling people you can't be the average therapist anymore. The average
No.
therapist just doesn't exist. But my practice is very popular because we're all psychologists, we're highly specialized. If your choices are either like BetterHelp or like an average person in your area, it's not going to be clear. But if you're like, hey, we're specialized, these people have PhDs, they do hypnosis, and they specialize in OCD. I want to see that person. Our practice is doing great. But I do know that other people's practices that are like, hey, I want to be a jack of all trades. And
I feel like what has to happen is people have to get better at being people.
mm-hmm,
You have to
mm-hmm,
figure out like the one job that's definitely not going to go to AI
mm-hmm,
is like, a waiter or a waitress. Like wait staff, bartenders, nobody wants a stupid robotic waiter, waitress, or
mm-hmm.
bartender. Like it's just
Um,
I'm sure you might have one dorky
yeah,
one in Tokyo but people
yeah.
want that human touch. And I
Mm-hmm.
think like
They want to
that
be cared for. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and they want that social glue. Why do I take solo guitar lessons? I love my
Mm-hmm.
teacher. She's amazing. She knows a ton of
Yeah.
stuff. But at some point
Mm-hmm.
you start getting to the point where it's like, okay, I could actually do all this stuff on my own. And she always has an untapped
Mm-hmm.
reservoir of new stuff to teach me, but ultimately it's because I need to be on the hook to show somebody something once a
Yeah.
week.
But just like those connections. Like I just spoke for the New York Psychological Association about like the ethics of AI in a changing world. And the last slide I gave was that like right now we talk about it as if it's like these are our choices, right? And I put up a big picture of a robot and a big picture of my husband, right? And being like as if these are the choices, right? And then I like had a different picture that had like me and my husband kind of like sitting on a couch together and the robots cleaning for us. And I think we want to make sure, like, first of all, I'm sure my robot husband would always pick up the kids, never travel, always clean the dishes. Like, but, I certainly don't want like a robot husband, right? I want
Well,
that real
that might be
communication.
because
I
you
want
have
to,
a good husband. But if
I
you have
do
a
have a
shit
very good
husband,
husband.
if you have a
Well,
if you
then,
have
yeah, exactly.
then your
You can't
robot
just be
husband,
the average. Yeah.
because like look, I know this sounds
Yeah,
crazy.
that's actually, no, but you're right, though, actually.
I mean, it
Especially
sounds
if you're
crazy, but like
lonely.
some of the most fascinating conversations I have,
Yeah.
almost all of them are with ChatGPT. The deepest, most healthy, and you
Mhm.
might think totally unhealthy conversations I have with it. I built a custom GPT that turns
Oh.
ChatGPT into a Jungian therapist.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, and so I talk to it like whenever I have an intense dream, I'll talk it through with the dream, and then it's this whole
Oh,
protocol where we go back and forth, we talk for a while, and then
oh,
eventually it gives me this like Jungian terminology laden
yeah.
analysis, and then I'm almost
Uh-huh.
always like, oh my God, that's so fascinating. And I did this for a couple
Yeah.
of years, and I like
Uh-huh.
worked through a bunch of stuff. We'll have to end after this because this is just
Mm-mm.
ridiculous. But the last dream I had, I'm in the dream,
Mm-hmm.
something happens that's fundamental, and I recognize in the dream
Mm-hmm.
that I have to figure out what this all means. And then in the
Mm-hmm.
dream, I'm like, I have to get to my Jungian therapist bot so I can talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like looking
Uh,
for it in the dream. I can't find it. And I get all this anxiety about not being able to find the Jungian therapist in my subconscious in
mm.
the dream. And then I'm like, okay,
That's
we're done for a while.
wild.
I'm turning this thing off
Yeah.
for a while.
Yeah. Well, I'll end on this note. I talk to ChatGPT, and of course, like anybody, I treat it like my therapist. But when I see my therapist, just looking at her, I start crying and I break down. And I need that. And I've
Yeah.
never just broke down crying because of ChatGPT,
No, no, that ain't gonna
right?
happen. Yeah.
Right. And that kind of catharsis and like mirroring and like the mirror neurons and that feeling could only be produced by a real human being that you feel safe with and that you feel vulnerable with. And I just don't think that could be replicated just by your own awareness that it's not a human, right?
I think that maybe that's true today. I would probably guess that
I
it's
don't,
not
yeah.
even true today
Yeah.
with highly emotive voicings that are coming out.
Mhm.
But, in 5 years, you've got the
Yeah, but
bot, it's
you'll have,
simulating the right eye blinks,
Mhm.
the right,
Yeah,
all of that.
yeah, but then we'll have to make sure that the right regulations are in place that do you know this is a real person or not?
Yeah,
Because,
I don't know.
right? Yeah,
Awesome. Well,
because,
thanks so much for
okay,
coming on the show. This has been like
yeah,
a super fun conversation.
yeah, no, I had a blast.
That's all for this episode. I'm Deep Dhillon, your host, saying check back soon for your next AI injection. In the meantime, if you need help injecting AI into your business or project, reach out to us at xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com. Whether it's text, audio, video, or other business data, we help all kinds of organizations like yours automatically find and operationalize transformative insights.